Okay, next slide. Before we start, we're going to observe a moment of silence to acknowledge the loss of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. So if you just join me in a few moments of silence. The violence against the African American community is one of the reasons we're having the session we're having today. Next slide. We're specifically talking about the impact of COVID-19 in Detroit and how racism has a part in exacerbating existing inequalities. I'd also like to mention an excellent resource by Kimberly Crenshaw, which we're put in the chat, that addresses many of these issues. But today, this presentation, I guess I should say my name is Trina Shanks. I am Director of Community Engagement for the School of Social Work and a professor at the School of Social Work. This presentation today is brought to you by my ENGAGE team, which includes Sonia Harb, Fatima Salman, Aisha Ghazi, our field intern, Jamie Sibbons, and with frequent assistance by Dominique Crump. The ENGAGE School of Social Work initiative is an effort to connect the school to communities and organizations to increase their ability and resources to meet their own goals. Community engagement is a major pillar of the school's strategic plan, and we're delighted to be able to contribute alongside the efforts of many faculty, students, and staff in this area. As I mentioned, today's session will be focused on how COVID-19 is exacerbating racial and economic inequity in Detroit. Joining us will be Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Jamila from the My COVID community. And we also will have some question and answers at the end led by Jamie Simmons and the Common Roots organization at the School of Social Work. And we'll hopefully be able to open up some questions and answers at the end if time permits. And then do some closing and reminders, because this session has really been about providing opportunities to volunteer in response to the COVID pandemic. And we've been doing that in partnership with Dan and the Office of Field Education. And so we'll do some of those closing reminders at the end. Next slide. Next slide. Go back up one. So it's my honor to be able to introduce Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who represents the 13th Congressional District of Detroit. So please, Rashida, we're turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Trina, and thank you to all of the folks that work at the University of Michigan social work, but mostly the community outreach work that you all do. I can tell when somebody that joins my team is from the School of Social Work and are really centered around social justice and community organizing as they deliver to my district. I represent the 13th Congressional District, which is the third poorest congressional district in the country. One of the things to know about what's happening, and we've heard you've seen the various numbers out there, but 40% of those that have passed on because of COVID have been African Americans, even though they make up less than 15% of the total population in Michigan. My district is about 60% African American, but one thing to realize is, many of my neighbors who are now considered essential workers, just a few months ago were not, but now they are. One of 4 of essential workers that live in Detroit. So one of 4 of my neighbors are now required to continue to work in places that are probably very much open to the public. And I'm not just talking about grocery stores, but also security guards in downtown. I've talked to a number of those folks and just a number of workers at Amazon and other places. So we want to center a lot of advocacy around some of the structural racism, but also really around what I call the P word. Sometimes nobody wants to talk about it, is poverty and the real economic divide that we have in our nation. And it really has shown its ugly face during the pandemic. Realize water was a big crisis already prior to the pandemic. I had worked with Congresswoman Debbie Dingell to introduce water as a human right. We got that in the HEROES Act, which was really critical, but the pandemic finally had this kind of awakening for my colleagues. I had to really advocate and tell them, look, just like we're fighting for masks and sanitizer and all these PPEs and all the things that, prevent the spread of COVID, did you all know thousands of people in my district do not have access to water? And then I took a deeper dive, Trina and everybody that's listening, you should know 1 of 20 Americans across the country lack access to water right now. That's 15 million people. And so what was really frustrating as the governor and everybody was, continuing to tell us, wash our hands, so many of my neighbors could not do that. And the hard part of that, kind of what I would call the structural, the structures that were set in place, and again, very painful, is so many of younger families were not coming forward and saying, hey, I need help, primarily because, the next day, if they got a water shut off and they were trying to seek help, Child Protective Services would show up and take their children away because it's considered neglect not to have access to water. So it is this top, situation where you have these challenges literally layered on a lot of my neighbors, again, predominantly African Americans. It's, people say this all the time, but it's so expensive to be poor in our country. But it's also very much a form of oppression that you see continue on through lack of access to water, lack of access to healthcare, and the fact that many of my neighbors are not those that are privileged or blessed to be able to work from home. So we really fought hard and got $1.5 billion. I think we need more to provide direct aid to low-income families to get their water back on. There was a lot of pushback in saying we should probably go through the utilities, or that we should go and work with these authorities. But what we realize is, even now with the moratorium, a lot of our neighbors still don't have access to water. Even though we're being told that various excuses, I can tell you right now, if they can build a stadium in downtown Detroit in less than a few months, and have access to water through that facility, then that we should be able to, and a lot of it was public money, we should be able to do it for a lot of our neighbors. The one thing too is to realize one of the I think, economic equity that I feel like is very much in place is around these continued, corporate bailouts versus a people's bailout. So we've been really fighting hard and saying, look, you want to support small businesses, you want to fight back on what's happening with this pandemic, you have to give people direct payments in their hands. It's $1,200 one payment. I mean, by the time the $1,200, some of my neighbors still haven't gotten theirs. They've already spent it. It's already gone. So we want to see reoccurring payments, and other countries are doing that. And this would be the Boost to Communities Act, Automatic Boost to Communities Act. And it would be $2,000 every month for every individual. And it's very expansive. It doesn't leave anybody. If you live in the United States, you do not deserve to die from COVID. You deserve to be able to, feel safe and be able to take care of yourself. And so it'll be $2,000 during the pandemic. And then, and this is what economists tell you, even after the pandemic, and we maybe, be able to get a vaccine, we still will feel that the economic impact, but also the quality of life impact that we're going to see on our neighbors. So we want to continue a year after the pandemic, $1,000 a month. And we do this through a pre-charged debit card in the Automatic Boost to Communities Act. And in there, tucked in there, Trina, and to everyone listening, is what we call the first responders core. So we want to also hire people and bring them on board to go to some of the most vulnerable communities, knock on the doors, get the cards and information. What I love about it too is that we would be able to work with a transient community, like our homeless neighbors and folks that right now, they don't have a mailing address, but we want to be able to get these cards to the shelters and to other locations. And I learned this really a lot from my sister, who counsels survivors of domestic violence, and saying they're left out in this process because, their safety reasons and not being able to have a mailing address. And again, the first responder corps will be able to address that. I have other things that I'm really working on. As you know, prior to the pandemic, environmental racism was very real in my district. I know many advocates at University of Michigan have been really key and elevating what's happening here. So, my neighbors and folks in 48217 are those that live near Fiat Chrysler in the east side of Detroit. to even those that live near the airport, near Romulus, all to tell you is that the expansion, like our impact on our air and our water quality, all of that has actually exacerbated conditions for those that do contract COVID. And so we really want to recognize a lot of these broken systems existed prior to the pandemic, but now it's really shown its ugly face. And, a lot of people are ironically surprised that our Black neighbors are dying at a higher rate. They're shocked to see these statistics that I think many of us have been talking about for a very long time, especially, again, my residents in the downriver, or what I call Tri-Cities, Ecorse, River Rouge, 48217, and even a lot of our neighbors in south end of Dearborn, seeing kind of the spike of deaths in those communities is because a lot of them have pre-existing conditions that were exacerbated by dirty air and dirty water. But with that, Trina, I really do appreciate us centering around speaking the truth about the reality of what we have in our country right now, which is a lot of broken systems. I think a resident of mine says to me, we don't have health care, we have sick care. And when you see hospitals trying to close down in my district, I'm just taken aback because I think to myself, wow, we have more sick people right now. I mean, we reached over 100,000 people died of COVID already, 1.3 million growing of people that have COVID, that you would think that people would be able to be lucrative, because a lot of these hospitals are for profit right now. And people don't understand that. DMC is not the same DMC that many of us grew up with. And so the fact that it's actually is not lucrative to take care of sick people in hospitals and in our healthcare system, it's actually costing them money, tells you just how really broken it is. During a pandemic, they should actually be able to keep their doors open, but that's not exactly what's happening. And again, I really want to recognize that and acknowledge that. And I hope, as we move forward, there's a quote from Sonia Renee Taylor who says, friends, let's not go back to normal. That wasn't normal. That the corporate greed, the inequity, all the brokenness that we were just talking about, all of that was not normal. And that this is our chance to create a new garment. So I hope that we work together to doing that and making sure that people don't forget. That's my biggest fear, is that people will look back at this and say, yeah, that happened, but then not actually proceed with tangible actions to make a difference. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rashida. I think it's so important that you came on and you're really emphasizing how it's impacting equity in Detroit. I'd also like to now introduce Jamila Martin, who is the strategic advisor for Michigan.
Aisha, hold on just a second. There was a question that came from the audience for Rashida. Sure. She has time to answer it. Can I have information for volunteering in your district? So do you have any volunteer opportunities, Rashida?
So if you are a person between the age of 14 and 24, if you're older, it's okay too. We actually have Mama Lila Cabell Fellowship right now that we have some slots open. And this is not a volunteer, but it's actually where we have you come in and do some community organizing in various neighborhoods. But I'll post the information of where to get more information on the chat. But that is where I would encourage people. And Mama Lila Cabell worked with Rosa Parks until she took her last breath. And she was one of our water warriors in Detroit. And suddenly she lost her life a year or so ago, I think now. It seemed just yesterday. But we really want people to be able to do it. Now, on the official end, we are doing wellness check-ins, things like that. But we are very careful because if folks want to come in and do like internships, that's great, because then they can come in as an official staff person. On the unofficial end, there's a little bit more flexibility. And you can always go to the websites to get that information. Again, I'll put it on there. But we're doing wellness check-ins. What I love about the wellness check-ins is we're literally just calling people and saying, hey, we care about you. What do you need? Masks. We're setting up grocery drop-offs, working with Focus Hope, Gleaners, who are now also, Focus Hope specifically is helping get diapers to people, formula. We also are helping because a lot of folks are really wanting to get testing, but unfortunately there's some scams out there, and there's also urgent cares that have like BOMA urgent care. But I don't know if you all know, even if there's a hospital name attached to it, it is actually a for-profit, and they are charging our neighbors to get tested. Please go to free testing locations. And there's also mobile testing. And if you follow me on social media, I'm constantly sharing these locations and the different things that are happening across the district. And so as you ask about volunteering, I wanted to just center you on this thing that I learned, is that you have to work your backyard. So there's a network of people that live around you that need a wellness check-in. There's also an opportunity in your community to even set up something on social media where you're sharing information. That actually helps me expand the work that I'm doing. Because when we're showing up for each other like that, we really are going to be able to save lives. So I would encourage you to really find a way. And we've been doing this with a lot of folks. Like after we check in on somebody, we say, hey, can you check in on 3 other people? 60% of the people we contact say absolutely. And they actually follow up with us and say, here's the 3 people we checked up on. So it's been really critically important, because I don't think people realize there's a lot of folks that are alone and do not have family near them or any other help. And again, want to be able to let them know there's folks out here just ready to be able to serve them and ready to be able to provide for them. But again, I'll put the information. I know how to use the question and answer thing now, so I'll make sure to go in there. I know I had a hard time getting on. I'm getting much, much better, I swear, Trina. I let people think I'm a millennial. I just want you all know I'm 43 years old, and we didn't even have cell phones when I got into college, but that's okay. I'm gonna work on it.
Rashida, well, you can send us the link also, and we can also send it to all participants. So all participants that are attending, we can send it out after this webinar as well.
Yeah. I'm going to find a correct one, so I'll send it to you all.
Okay, do we have time for one more question, Rashida? If anyone else would like to ask anything.
I'm sorry, I should have opened up for questions. I thought Jamila wanted to present first. You're good. Yeah, so if you go, I'll put it on the chat, but if you do have questions you don't want to ask on this call, this is our main email is rashida@mail.house.gov. And when you do ask about even volunteer opportunities, like be specific what you want to do. There's so many opportunities out there, like connecting you to We the People, who are dropping off water, working with water stations and dropping off water throughout the city. We also have Brightmore Connections. Food Pantry is phenomenal, and they would welcome volunteers. We also know Focus Hope is still very much engaging volunteers for grocery drop-off. And if you've never experienced it, it's really, right now we all feel very helpless and seeing so much death and illness and people just, everything. And then on top of that, the violence towards our Black neighbors with police and these vigilantes and some will call terrorists coming after people. I know that some of that can be very paralyzing and very traumatic. But when we get out there and we engage each other in that way, again, very much direct kind of human contact, protecting ourselves, of course, and making sure we're not spreading COVID. But when you deliver groceries, when you get people masks, when you just even getting people information of where they can get tested, it really does help show that people power. And when we center around people movement like this, it can really make a tremendous difference to push back. And true transformative change really doesn't happen in the halls of Congress. I'm telling you, I've been there a year. I see it. There's a lack of urgency and disconnection of the pain and the hurt that's happening on the ground. And it's our job to remind them and push back, but it's also for us to show up for each other is something that nothing can replace. And again, I feel like no matter who is sometimes even in the White House, that change doesn't happen unless the streets demand it. And I feel like this is a kind of grassroots work that we need to be able to to help us, one, not become numb, to really show people that there's this, lightness and this hope out here, that people actually care, and they believe in humanity and the morality of access to water, food. Like, no one should be left behind during this pandemic.
Rashida, one more question from the audience. Are there initiatives to make sure low-income communities have masks, gloves, and those supplies?
So a lot of the work that's been happening is through what we call federally accredited clinics, are doing a lot of the mobile testing. And now, if you notice, they're not asking for prescriptions anymore, which was really a true barrier to getting testing. So I know in the 13th district, when you call my office and you live in my district, unfortunately, we're not supposed to, we're somewhat sometimes we do, and we just don't tell the other members of Congress. But if you are in need of that, you can reach out to us and we get it out. So what we've been doing, Trina, is we've been checking in our faith-based communities, and we've been checking with our Black clubs and other places, and we're dropping off packages of masks to them. And like right now, we're doing like senior meals, but at the same time, every meal we put in a Ziploc bag a mask. We also are trying to get more sanitizer out, because a lot of folks that are using mass transit and things like that want to be able to have sanitizer, and they still are not able. And a lot of residents tell me they can't find it right now. So we're trying to order large stocks of that. So just know that that's happening. Like we're working actually with the Chairman Jonathan Kinlack now, the 13th Congressional District, a day where we're meeting at the Union Hall to get out masks. And then with mobile testing, we're working with all the faith-based organizations. We're setting up some of the, what we would call, I think, really centered African-American communities that are, have higher rates of COVID right now and high rates of death of COVID, where we're doing mobile testing in those areas. And it's really Access and Wayne State University that's leading that effort. What else? Yeah, and so the one thing to know is we just called this other church, just told me, hey, we don't have anybody come in and get food boxes. And it's because a lot of these local grassroots groups are phenomenal. They're very rooted in the community, but they don't have money for PR, y'all. It's always word of mouth. So when you call and you find out, I always tell people, go tell like a few more other people, because it's not like they have money or marketing to do, mailings or to run ads so you all know. But I have never had a chance where if I needed a group to be able to lead getting masks out, if I call that, they're like, oh, we're already doing that. It's just the community, it doesn't know, because a lot of it, again, is, not being able to have, ways to really connect, and other than door to door, which is continues to be, with all the technology, continues to be the most effective way to get people resources. I hope that answers the question. Is there any others?
Trina, I think you're muted.
Real quick, a lot of people have been saying thank you, and we appreciate your time and giving us all this great information. One graduate of our program, Yusuf Secure, said that his place has been giving away free school supplies and masks, and we'll try to get his number in the chat for everybody to look at.
He's been doing that prior to the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's two more quick questions if you have time. Do you have time for two more quick questions?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One is there another payment that's going to be going out to folks due to the stay-at-home order being extended? And then two, do you think Governor Whitmer's leadership has been successfully responding to the needs of Detroit in relation to the rest of the state?
So I think if any, to answer the later question first, look, if Governor Whitmer is actually listening to the health experts and not the Chamber of Commerce and the special interest groups, and really listening to the health experts, I think one thing I've learned is, as elected people, I want you all to know, we are not doctors. We are not health experts. We do not understand, COVID. It's, again, a pandemic that is still very much studied, as you all know and hear about. Some drugs work for others, some don't. all of the things that come with something that is extremely new to society and to our world. So as long as any public official, and I know there's a lot of gaslighting out there, misleading information. Every time I have calls with the governor and her team, I ask specifically, where is that coming from? And if it's coming from our public health officer, Dr. Khaldun, if it's coming from, the specific information we're getting from CDC, then the decision is very much informed on science and facts. Then we're succeeding. That's all we have to base it on, not theories. My God, early on, did you not hear people say that African Americans could not get COVID? That children couldn't get COVID? I mean, you heard all the rumors out there. Look what happened. I mean, when Skylar Herbert died at 5 years old, African-American little girl died of COVID, I said to them, see folks, you have to listen to the experts. And it's okay when they come back and they say, I don't know, then don't guess. The fact that they don't know, you should actually be much more cautious, is the fact that they don't know what the impact on pregnant women are, on children, on, they said, oh, it's only seniors dying. No, we see young people dying from COVID. So I just want to reiterate that. Now, if we're talking about direct payment from the federal government, and, as you all know, there was a $1,200 per person allotment to folks that, should already been gone to everybody, but it's not. And then $500 for your dependents. There is in the latest bill that passed out of the House, but has not passed out of Senator McConnell's shop. The Senate is run by, really just seems to be run by one man. But Senator McConnell has the HEROES bill that has an additional $1,200 direct payment again in there. And it's also very expansive. So if you have children, you're actually going to get a little bit more hike of it, because they're going to give you more of a child credit. But again, that is right now in the Senate. So I know Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters, if you're a Michigander, they are very much supportive of that. But it still really does help when you call, you email and drop them an email and letting you know this is a priority for you, because so much is in the HEROES Act that was passed. A lot of it's around state and local government. But they also, because I'm a person that feels like direct payment should be absolutely a priority. It is the way to provide human dignity for people, because I'll tell you right now, moratoriums are great, but then they end. When they end, the rent is due for the 3 months that you were under moratorium. The mortgage is due, the student loan is due, the water bill is due. All the moratoriums of protecting people during the pandemic is great, but when it's all done, what's going to happen is everybody is going to get shut-offs. They're going to get evicted. They're going to lose their homes. And so we need to figure out, how do we create stability for everyone? And direct payments to me is very key. And small businesses, real small businesses, very much support direct payment, because they know when people have the resources and be able to take care of, I always say, there's a saying even as among Muslims, if you take care of your home, then you got to take care of your community. People take care of their home and then they go and spend it in their local communities, the local restaurant. And that's the great thing about direct payments. We don't hoard it like corporations do. Some people say it's bad that we're not great savers, us, okay? We're bit spenders, Americans. But the problem is we're in debt like all the time. We're living check by check. I mean, the majority of my neighbors were survivor mode, literally living check by check. And so to have like a literal layer of protection, and then allowing people to decide what they need to spend it on. And community-based organizations tell me this is the most important thing, is they can work with these families, with our families, and say, hey, this week, let's get this DTE paid off. Yes, you have a moratorium, but let's get this done. And I think it could be extremely powerful if we have reoccurring payments. But just to know, that's one reason I almost hesitated to vote for the HEROES Act, is primarily because it didn't have reoccurring payments. However, it does have one payment, and it's in the Senate, and there is discussion about the next package, including some sort of form of reoccurring payments. I just don't know what it's going to look like. I would prefer it to be the ABC Act that I'm promoting, the Automatic Boost to Communities Act, but I think it may not get to that point, but you never know. I always say things that people think are impossible are possible if people on the outside are demanding it. So I hope that answers everybody's question. I'm sure there's more now. I'm talking so much.
Well, at this point, I will stop the questions for you. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Tlaib. And I'm going to pass it over to Aisha, who's going to introduce our second speaker, Jamila Martin.
Hi, everyone. And, I do want to acknowledge that, well, firstly, thank you so much, Rashida. That was amazing. And we're so lucky to have you on with us. And I know that Common Roots has put together some questions, which we will get to at the end. So next up, I am excited to welcome Jamila Martin, who is the Strategic Advisor for Michigan for Movement Vote. She's also the co-founder of 482 Forward, and she helps with the My COVID Community Mutual Aid Network. So welcome, Jamila. And Fatima, if you can go to the next slide, please. And Jamila, if you want to go ahead, let me just make sure you are.
Great. I think I should be unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can both hear and see me. I apologize. I am on my phone because my webcam stopped working right before the pandemic. And I thought to myself, no big deal. Fine. Like, I use it occasionally for Zoom. And then it turned out it was my only mode of communication. So I have to use my phone for video. So I apologize. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my COVID community, how we came together, why we came together, what we've been working on across the state. I won't go into too much detail, and then maybe through the questions, folks can pick out the things that are more interesting or you want to hear more about. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and those of us who were working in community organizations, organizing for long-term system and policy change, we realized that we just were not prepared for the level of organizing and policy agenda setting that was really needed to address this crisis. Most of us were used to working in organizations on specific issues. I came from an organization that worked specifically on education. Stuff that affected folks in prisons, stuff that affected folks who were bus riders, or, were dealing with environmental justice issues. We would try to support here and there, but primarily that stuff was pretty siloed from our work. And it became clear that that was not gonna work for this moment. So we had to do something different. There were so many needs that were all intermingled. And really, more to the point, there was a bigger picture that needed to be painted and a bigger agenda that needed to be driven, that none of us kind of just speaking to our individual issues was going to be able to do. This was kind of a seismic shift moment that, reminds you of the Great Depression and the New Deal, and moments when whole new policy agendas were put forward to really recreate how society works and how we take care of ourselves. And we just didn't have a vehicle, we didn't have a way to do that organizing the way that we had been organizing so far. So we very quickly, honestly, just created a Google Doc and just invited like anybody that was doing organizing around the state that we knew and were in a relationship with to just put some stuff in a Google Doc about what they thought the primary policy demands for the immediate emergency response needed to be on their issue. And over the course of, I think, 36 or 48 hours with, I don't know, maybe dozens or maybe 20 or 30 organizations participating from many different issue areas, we turned that into a policy agenda. And you can find that at the at mycovidcommunity.com or .org. That's a good question. .com.
I think it's on the next slide, Fatima, if you want to go to the next one.
Yeah, and I think I tried to add some other slides that I'm not sure there. Sorry guys, this was my fault because I added some slides super late to the PowerPoint presentation. But ultimately, that policy agenda got broken up into 9 buckets. again, it was still kind of siloed in the way that we think about issues and the way that we kind of organize policy activism sometimes, but the point was to put it together and have a shared agenda that each of us could show up for the others, even if it was kind of out of our normal wheelhouse. So those buckets were healthcare, work, income, and small business, housing, water, food, and utilities, education and childcare, democracy and information, immigration, vulnerable populations, and climate and environment. I won't go into what each of the set of demands were under each of those. You can go online and look. And remember, that's an early policy agenda. What's on the website now was really an early policy agenda that was put together at the beginning of the crisis. Right now, a lot of those issues have been, over the course of the past couple of months, a lot of those policy demands have moved, and we're able to move really, a lot of it because of some great organizing that folks did. Ultimately, I think, in a week or so, over 100 organizations across the state signed on to this agenda, and we're pushing the governor and other folks to move these things primarily through executive orders. And so what we saw was that with the legislature out, not voting for a while, the governor's office was able to make significant headway on a lot of these equity issues through her use of executive orders. And then kind of predictably, there was a tremendous amount of pushback from conservative forces in the state who made the strategic decision to not focus so much on the issues themselves, which are widely popular and everybody understands are critical for our ability to survive this pandemic broadly across the state, but to push back specifically on this executive order, on the ability itself of the governor to have executive orders and to turn it into a referendum on people's freedom. And so it was a national strategy that folks have been using across the country to roll back some of the gains that communities have made during the pandemic. But by focusing specifically on she's overstepping her boundaries, she's taking away your freedom, they were able to kind of create this wedge around the ability to use these executive orders, which really were the way that we were able to win all of the movement forward that we've won so far. So it's really important to be clear for folks on why that battle between the legislature and the governor over the state of emergency, over her use of executive orders, them taking her to court, why that was so important. It was really a tactic that they were using to roll back all of these other things they never talked about. They weren't talking about eviction moratoriums or making sure that people had access to free healthcare and free testing the way that Rashida talked about, or making sure that teachers could still get paid even though school wasn't in physical session. All of that stuff was able to happen through executive orders. And if they had talked about the things, people would have been like, what are you talking about? Of course we want those things to happen. But that's not what they talked about. They talked about, the governor's overstepping. So, we mobilized across the network of my COVID community endorsers for a week of action to try to maintain, to try to kind of show that Michiganders did support the policies that were being put in place. We ran a week of action leading up to when the legislature was going to be returning to session, because we had been told that essentially when the legislature was coming back, the leadership was planning on ending the state of emergency. And they had already given not just indication, but frankly, they had already declined to extend the state of emergency. And there's some detail there, but they had already basically said, we're going to do this, because they had already kind of done it once to some extent. And so for us, that was a direct threat to this entire agenda, to our ability to move this entire agenda forward, because if that ended and if the governor's ability to use executive orders was ended, we knew that our current legislature would never move any of the demands forward that we were advocating. So we ran a week of action, and it was the first time that many of the organizations across my COVID community had been able to work together in this way. So it was actually really exciting, for people to talk about so many different issues, but in this really shared, coordinated way, and to be able to push it out to their membership across the state. I think that there's a video I wanted to show. Every day there were different videos. So we had kind of an overarching framing video that explained the entire kind of core of the week of action. And then each day focused on one of the issue buckets. And so there were kind of videos for each of those as well. And then ultimately the ask was for folks to call and contact the legislature. And we had tens of thousands of emails and phone calls and tweets that went to the legislature. So I'm just going to show that video. Hopefully.
Hold on, I'm gonna have to switch to another computer. Sorry about that, because there's no voice on that computer. 1 second.
Sorry, this is my fault, you guys. I put it in super last minute. So I created technical difficulties where there didn't need to be any.
That's all right, we got this. And then if everybody could just tell me if it's too loud or.
It comes down to a simple choice. On April 30th, will the legislature sacrifice people's lives for an economy that only works for the 1%? Or will they provide real economic relief and safety for everyone? No exceptions.
In over just 6 weeks, we have mourned the loss of 2,500 loved ones. Over 31,000 Michiganders are still battling this disease, some in crowded conditions behind bars.
At the same time, millions are facing unimaginable hardships, many that have existed already and now have been amplified by this pandemic.
We shouldn't have to choose between our lives or our livelihood. In our Michigan, no one gets left behind.
Decidimos ser protegidos y seguros con quedarnos en casa, cuidar de nuestros seres queridos, vecinos y los que están en el pie del cañón.
Michiganders are taking action on issues that are important to us. We're asking our legislature to extend the state of emergency, the stay-at-home order, and provide relief and safety for all of us, no exceptions.
Join us by emailing or tweeting your legislators and sharing your story today.
So the goal, in that video and in that week of action was really to highlight for folks the false choice that the legislature is making us, is making the state make essentially between our lives and our livelihood. I'm sure this is stuff that you guys have talked about a lot and are really familiar with, so I won't go into too much. I will say that what's coming up next is going to be significant fights around both the state budget and voting in August and November. So our state budget just for this year is predicted to have a $2.5 billion shortfall because of the pandemic. To give you some context, the general fund itself is only $10 billion, which is how we pay for most of the state things. $10 billion for the general fund, about $13 billion for the school aid fund. And so a cut of $2.5 billion, And that's just from now through September, which is when our fiscal year ends. So think of it as cutting $2.5 billion, but only in 6 months, only in a smaller amount of time than a normal year, is going to mean massive budget cuts across the state, massive cuts to services, to everything that our communities depend on and that we really need more than ever right now. And so how the legislature handles that, where they make cuts, but in particular, if they're willing to raise new revenue and new revenue in a fair way, is going to be a huge issue that the My COVID community endorsers are going to be focusing on, and that we will be kind of asking Michiganders broadly to start pushing on the legislature. The second is voting, and in particular, voting safely and voting from home. Organizations are starting to work with their members to learn how to register online, to learn how to apply for their absentee ballot online. You probably heard that absentee ballots are going to be sent to every registered voter, which is, not absentee ballots, absentee ballot applications. Very different, and I apologize. Absentee ballot applications are going to be sent to every registered voter, and that's super, super important and a huge step forward. But a lot of folks are not at the address that they registered at. A lot of folks are not going to see that piece of mail. A lot of folks are going to see that piece of mail, not know what it is, and throw it away. And, there are kind of folks in the state who are going to work really hard to make sure that we lose access to the ballot because of this pandemic. And are going to try to make it really difficult. So there's a huge effort that has to be undertaken by community organizations, by folks like yourselves, to help people get access safely to the ballot by voting from home and by using all of these new rights, many of which were won in 2018 through a ballot initiative, by using these new rights to register online, to apply for an absentee ballot online or by mail, and then to mail in our ballots with no excuse, no matter who we are. So there needs to be a huge effort to help people actually access that for the first time for most of us. So I'll stop there, and then I guess I don't know if questions or whatever is the next part of the agenda.
Thank you so much, Jamila. And I think that, the work of My COVID community really shows how sometimes it's a crisis that helps organizations realize that they have to really organize across what they're doing in silos and come together and make a shared agenda, and that all of their fights for justice are connected, and that's really the only way to push things. Speaking of which, it's similar to the student group that we're going to introduce. Common Roots has developed some questions they'd like to ask you. And Common Roots is a coalition of the following School of Social Work student organizations: Association of Black Social Work Students, Latinx Coalition, Black Radical Healing Pathways, the API Coalition, General Student Body members, and the DEI office. So I would like to introduce Jamie Simmons, and she is going to help facilitate some questions from Common Roots.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Like Aisha mentioned, my name is Jamie Simmons, and I'm representing Common Roots today, and I'm also the president of the Association of Black Social Work Students. We have organized some questions for you, Jamila, and one of the most important questions on our list was, what equity issues has the pandemic highlighted in Detroit?
Yeah, Rashida spoke to this a bit in her talk. I think the pandemic has highlighted equity issues across the state, really in every issue bucket that we laid out in our agenda. There is an equity issue that's being kind of exacerbated, that already existed and has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So things like prison population. So obviously there's a huge issue with folks who are in prisons. We have way too many folks who are getting infected, folks who are not being let out when really they should be. And of course, we know that Black and brown folks are way more likely to be in prisons and jails right now. And so the impact of who's being affected in prisons is significantly weighted towards Black and brown folks, in particular Black and brown men. who are way over incarcerated across the country, but also in Michigan. Same goes for water access. Rashida talked about it a lot. Lack of access to water affects Black and brown folks predominantly. It's a huge issue in Detroit and in Flint. The access to clean water and water shutoffs. Same goes for healthcare, immigration. I mean, honestly, throughout each of the, in every issue area, there was a pre-existing set of systemic inequities that are now pushed even more to the forefront because of this pandemic.
Thank you for that. And you highlighted a lot of things, especially with policy. And one of the questions that we had was around policy, and what policy do you think directly helped in creating such a mass vulnerable situation within the city of Detroit, and what policy needs to be in place in the future to combat the things that have happened from the pandemic and to possibly prevent it from ever happening again in the city?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's not one policy. There are millions of policies that have happened that have put us in the place where we are now, that have made Detroiters more vulnerable to COVID-19. Just something as basic as like, who has the luxury and the privilege of not going to work every day? You know, for folks who are working in the service industry, folks who are working in restaurants, folks who are working essential jobs in nursing homes, you know, low paid service jobs are predominantly filled by Black and brown folks. And those are the so-called essential jobs, or really sacrificial jobs. And those folks have had to keep going. People are also, how are they getting to those jobs? They're taking the bus. You know, people don't have access to cars in Detroit for a variety of reasons. Insurance is a big one. And I'm sure that you guys are familiar with all of the redlining that has gone on around insurance, and how unbelievably high insurance rates are for Detroiters compared to everybody else in the state of Michigan. So people don't drive. So folks are taking the bus to work. So now they still have to go to work, and they have to take the bus to go there. And obviously the bus is going to be a much easier way to catch COVID-19 from being around folks on public transportation. And you saw bus drivers actually go on strike to try to get some basic protections even for themselves that weren't put in place when this originally started. So, I mean, there is kind of policy after policy after policy after policy that's been put in place that has gotten us to the point where folks are so much more vulnerable. You know, I didn't even talk about access to healthcare, or for our undocumented residents who live in the city, who are, you know, afraid to go and get tested, afraid to access any kind of healthcare system or support. That's a huge area that not enough groups are working on. Some really amazing groups are working on it, but we need more folks to be standing up around the rights of undocumented folks in this time. If you look at the testing numbers and the positive rates of COVID-19, Southwest Detroit is really underrepresented. And we have to assume that that's because folks are afraid to access the testing, to access healthcare, and not that they're not actually getting it, because they're working like everybody else. They're taking the bus like everybody else, but they're not even able to access basic care because they're too afraid that they'll be deported if they do. So like I said, policy after policy after policy has put us in this situation. What do I think? Policies that will get us out of it? Again, like, there's not going to be there's not one kind of silver bullet policy to this. Each of those issues and each of those systemic inequities needs to be addressed on its own. I will say that I think there is an opportunity here for us to make a leap, like a social leap. And people have been like, this is not new. People have been talking about this idea, similar to when there have been these like kind of, what's the word I want to use? almost like social cracks in the past. You know, things like the Depression allowed us to have the New Deal. It was the first time that we had a real social safety network put in place. Lots of problems with it, but you know, it was only because of the incredible crisis that the country and the world was in that lawmakers were able to put forward something that big and that transformative. And I think that I hope that this is a moment when we can do that again. And I don't think it's coincidental that folks have been talking so much about the Green New Deal over the past year or two, and that, you know, there is no bigger challenge facing us than, you know, the kind of COVID-19, and no more similar challenge in some ways than the challenge of climate change. And so for us to be able to come out of this pandemic by kind of revisioning our society, rebuilding a new safety net that isn't based on some of the old ways, you know, where your healthcare is tied to your employer, or where you know, Black and brown folks don't get access to the social services that were built into the New Deal. But to do a new deal that actually works for everybody, and that takes on the next big challenge of our time, which is climate change, I think is, you know, I think is the only way we get out of this, honestly.
Thank you, and I appreciate you bringing in the conversation around climate change and how that needs to be the forefront of a lot of the conversations we are having right now and for the future. Another question Common Roots had is kind of in response to what we've been seeing via the news and social media of a lot of community organizations coming together and supporting the city of Detroit, and a lot of people using their own resources and their homes to help individuals in this crisis as well. Our question really has to do with, like, how do you think this pandemic allowed for these organizations to come together so well and created a lot of opportunity for people to organize, and also what has been the strengths in creating these mutual aid networks and obstacles?
Yeah. So I will say, you know, honestly, I personally haven't been engaged so much in the part of the organizing, which there is a piece of the My COVID community network that works on this, and where organizations that are engaging in this come together to share and to support each other. But around the mutual aid, where it's like a direct exchange of services, I think that's a really critical part of what's happening right now, especially given the amount of social isolation and limited resources that people have. I think, you know, in terms of My COVID community more broadly, obviously, you know, kind of as Aisha said, the moment, like the size of this crisis really forced us to come together in ways that we hadn't been able to do, hadn't imagined doing before. I think, I will say, I think that it's a challenging atmosphere to organize in, and people are really struggling to figure out ways to connect with neighbors and residents and friends and family when we can't be in person. So much of the way that we organized before now was based on our ability to be in person, whether that's to be at somebody's door, or to find them at an event, to find them at the club, to find them while they're standing in line at the grocery store, or while they're walking into the grocery store. You know, it was very much based on in-person interaction. And I think one of the other things that I'm hoping organizations can get through participating in My COVID community and in building relationships there is honestly just a community of practice to start to identify, you know, promising practices and successful strategies in doing the kind of organizing that we were doing before, but doing it remotely, which has a ton of challenges in terms of reaching folks who don't have access to the internet, or folks who aren't really using smartphones. They might be seniors, they might just not have a great smartphone, they might not have a great smartphone plan, might not have that much data. You know, there are some real barriers to organizing that are put in place by the quarantine. And so that's a challenge for us, and it's really going to be a challenge, especially as we come closer to the election and we're trying to reach everybody and make sure that they are getting access to their ballot. And we can't do it in person. We can't help them in person get through this very new difficult process. So That's something I'm hoping we can get good at by August and certainly by November.
And you bring up a good point about technology and accessibility to technology. Are you aware of any initiatives that is combating that that issue within the community in Michigan or in Detroit?
There was a pre-existing something called the Equitable Internet Initiative, EII. The partnership of a number of community-based organizations in the city, and I won't do justice to try to kind of explain all of what EII does and has done and how it was started. It's connected to Allied Media Project, which has a long history of working in the city around a number of things, but digital access is one of them. And that project currently is working to get low cost access to high-speed internet in a few neighborhoods around the city. And I think that they're hoping to really ramp that up now so that, to increase the number of families who have access. That's the main one that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure that there are others that I don't know.
Thank you. And you mentioned my COVID community, and one of the questions we had was, how can students help with my COVID community and other efforts going on?
Yeah, so the first thing is that anybody can join. It's open to both individuals and organizations. You can sign up online if you go to the About Us page. I think there's maybe a couple ways to get there, and I'm not thinking of them right now. I should have looked. But I think if you go to the About Us page, you can click and sign on as an individual, it asks you really to sign on to the agenda. And then individuals can join any of the committees. So we have a policy committee, we have a mutual aid committee, communications committee, a whole bunch of places to participate depending on what you're kind of interested in. There's also I could just facilitate folks getting connected to any of the organizations that are signed on to my COVID community if people want that. I mean, you can always just reach out directly to any of those organizations and volunteer with them directly, but I'm happy to figure out some more coordinated way of doing that with you all, because each of those organizations is doing a variety of things right now, kind of like what Rashida talked about. Some of the groups are doing water drops, some of the groups are doing wellness checks, some of the groups are doing food distribution, some of the groups are doing census work, starting to do vote work. Some groups are doing kind of all of those things, still trying to engage their members in advocacy around the policy agenda issues. So I would say two ways. So you can either sign up online just individually, and then you'll get an email and hopefully get connected into one of the committees if you want. Or we can coordinate something that's more, I don't know, that's the more coordinated, basically, to get folks connected to the direct organizations that are doing the organizing on the ground.
Thank you, Jamila. We actually have one question from the audience, and the question is: have you heard if there has been any discussion about access for mental health or mental wellness for Michiganders, and particularly people of color and low-income communities coming out of the pandemic?
That is a really good question, and it's one I don't know the answer to, but I can talk to some of the groups that are organizing specifically around healthcare. And get back to you guys. Michigan United is the organization that's been leading most of the conversations, most of the kind of policy conversations with the insurance companies and with the governor's office in terms of trying to increase access to healthcare specifically for folks. That's another place to look.
And we will be having another session at the end of the month that will be focused more on clinical interventions during COVID and talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that are going on in the community, just as an FYI.
And then also there's some people in our attendees that are saying that DWIHN and Wayne State University has mental health services that are being offered, and another group called Reach Us Detroit, if you go to reachusdetroit.org. And if you continue joining our webinars on a weekly basis, we will be having upcoming conversations focused on medicine if everybody wants to continue being with us every Thursday.
So Jamie, are there any other questions that you'd like to ask on behalf of Common Roots, or should we open it up to more questions? I think there's actually a question just came through. Oh no, that was a suggestion for clinical care. So yeah, Jamie, are there any other questions you'd like to ask?
I think this would be a good opportunity to open it up to the audience to ask their questions for Jamila.
Okay, great. So again, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type it in, and then we'll read them out.
We actually have one question from Jasmine, a member of Common Roots. And the question is, do you have any advice or best practices for people wanting to help that are not part of the community or a community organization?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there are a ton of organizations that folks can join. And, you know, these are membership-based organizations that that like want people like you if you are excited about getting involved. You know, right now you can kind of join anything anywhere because everything is remote, but it probably does make sense to still look for something in your area or something that you care about kind of issue-wise. I'm happy to point folks in a particular, like in the direction if you have specific questions about like an issue that you want to organize around and you're not sure who's doing organizing on that issue. But honestly, like a quick Google search probably will find some folks too. I would join some of their events first and like get to know them, and you know, join some of the, everything is online, but like see if they have online events, see if you can kind of get to know the organization first. But this is really a time when like people need new members. So, you know, look for something that you can join. And again, like I'm happy to connect you.
Jamila, how many organizations are part of the My COVID Community Network?
I think a little over 100 right now. I haven't looked at the list in a little bit.
And I know that's also available on your website. So let me just quickly read out something from one of our participants about Reach Us Detroit, which was the clinical care initiative that was recommended. And the Detroit COVID-19 Virtual Therapy Collaborative aims to remove stigma and barriers to treatment for African American males, single parents, transitional age youth, the hopeless adolescent, the isolated member of the LGBTQAI+ community, and the otherwise overlooked. So that seems like a great resource for people to look into that they can recommend.
Jamila, if I can ask you a quick question. I know that your typical focus area is education with 482 Forward. So can you say something about the right to literacy lawsuit that was settled and what implications that has for schools and school children in Detroit?
Yeah, so I'm not at 482 Forward anymore. So some of the details of the lawsuit I don't know as well as folks who are there. Essentially, the background is that there was a lawsuit that was brought against the state of Michigan. It was a federal lawsuit alleging that the state had essentially violated Detroit students' constitutional rights in the way that they had been running schools, both traditional public and charter, in the city of Detroit for about the past 15 years. And it was a case that was intended not only to try to bring some relief to Detroit students, but also to potentially establish a precedent for a right to education, a right to literacy, which has not been established and has been. Anyways, I won't get into like the law about that because I'm going to say something that's not true, but essentially is not a thing that we have right now. And so this was a case that people honestly were pretty unsure of. It was a little risky. Especially given the makeup of the court, and once the election happened in 2016, the makeup of the Supreme Court, and then also some of the judge seats that got filled after the 2016 election. So, so folks were a little bit nervous about how it would ultimately go. Recently, there was a decision in circuit court. Before it was a 3-judge panel in circuit court. I don't quite know how it works, but apparently you go to a panel first, in favor of the plaintiffs, in favor of the Detroit students. And that it was kind of a landmark decision because it did move forward this precedent nationally, because it's under federal law. At that point, folks asked the governor of the state to settle the lawsuit. It didn't make sense to continue to try to move it forward to higher courts. And so she ultimately did. I will say it took quite a bit of organizing to get the administration to settle there, unfortunately. And it took really longer than it should have for them to settle. And so there were both remedies for the individual plaintiffs, for the individual students who were part of the suit, as well as remedies for Detroit students broadly that the state agreed to. Unfortunately, the decision was then vacated at the circuit court. So, which I'm told is slightly different than being overturned. It's as if it never happened. But so the precedent does not stand for kind of the national point of view for students broadly to be able to push forward this right to education under our national constitution. But the settlement itself will stand. So Detroit students will get some relief, some more money, essentially, primarily for the school district.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. I'm curious, I don't know if there's time, I'm curious like what organizing folks are already doing. It sounds like there's a bunch of student organizations, and I can't imagine, I was an organizer on campus when I was in school, and now having everybody be at home, I'm super curious how student organizing has transitioned and what people have been able to do and how you're able to do it from home. So I don't know if there's any opportunity for me to get to ask participants, but I'm, really interested in how people are doing that.
Well, how about this? How about people start discussing this in chat and putting their things they're doing so we can be reading as they come through. But I can also go to the next slide and give my closing statements. And then as those statements come through, we can read them. Does that sound okay to you, Jamila?
Yeah, that would be great.
And Trina, there is a comment by Corintha Lachey Fisher, and I just want to read it out quickly. She said, "I just want to make a statement that I am so very happy that we have all of you working and making things happen on our behalf, Governor Whitmer included. We are so very blessed to have such powerful, intelligent, and caring women of the community at the forefront fighting for us. Thank you, ladies, and God bless you all." And I just want to echo that. I mean, I think, Rashida, this is the type of work that social work students can do now and in their careers. And I think as a final takeaway as well, it's important to organize across silos and continue to raise equity issues. And I encourage all of you to go check out the mycovidcommunity.com website and read their policy agenda. And we can get more information to you guys as well about how you can get involved to actually help out, because it's a powerful coalition of organizations. So I want to thank you, Jamila.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I'm excited for you to join the work, or you're probably already part of it. Not join the work, but continue to be part of it, to be honest.
So we will allow people to respond via chat if they want to give some examples of ways that they've been organizing or contributing during the pandemic in response to Jamila's question. But since we're running close to the end of time, I'm just going to remind people there's a volunteer list. It's the opportunities and organizations, including My COVID Community, where you might be able to sign up to volunteer. If you have volunteered, we'd like you to let us know through this form. And then we also have an archive. We will have an archive of this conversation, but all of our previous Thursday conversations at the link that's shown here. Anyone who is a field student who needs extra field hours, this session counts for field hours, and any of these volunteer opportunities count for field hours, but you do have to get permission from your field faculty instructor at the School of Social Work to get that credit. So just to remind everybody, there's a link where there's a long list that we update from time to time on volunteer opportunities. If you do volunteer, click on the form to let us know. It's very short. And any other past discussion that we've had, including this one, you can find at on our website, but also at this link. And so next Thursday, we're going to actually do a debrief on students and how things are going and what they've been doing. And our featured guest will be from Detroit Disability Power. So with that, has anything been added to the chat yet? Has anybody said about things they've been doing? If so, we can read those. Youssef has said, join the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion tomorrow. They're going to have a Zoom on COVID-19, and he gave an email link to register. So please do that if you can. And again, if anybody wants to say what they're doing or talk about opportunities, please put it in the chat. We will stay around for the next 10 minutes or so. But otherwise, I think we are about done. Thank you so much, Jamila. Of course, thank you to Congresswoman Tlaib, even though she's no longer with us. And thank you to the whole team for making this happen and to everyone who joined us. So we'll stay around for a few minutes. We'll keep the chat going, but I think that's kind of the end of our formal remarks. Thanks everybody for participating.